This is The Bottom Line, a show designed to help Australian businesses succeed. On the show, you'll hear from leading Australian business owners as they share the lessons they've learned building their companies. You'll learn from their successes as well as some of the challenges they faced along the way. We also talk to experts from a range of fields who share specialised techniques you can use to improve your business. I'm your host, Savan Tuna, and I'm a director at Alexander Spencer, and I'm really passionate about helping Australian businesses succeed. More and more Aussie founders are turning to employee share plans to attract top talent and keep their best people on board. But if these plans aren't set up properly, they can create more confusion than clarity and even lead to conflict down the track. So how do you make sure your plan actually works for your business and your team? Joining us on The Bottom Line is Darren Sommers, founder of Adventum Legal. Darren works closely with some of Australia's most exciting high-growth businesses, helping them navigate everything from capital raising and business structuring to building employee share plans that actually deliver. In this episode, we explore how to use employee share plans as a smart growth tool, the legal traps to avoid, and how one of Darren's clients used a well-designed share plan to transform their team and their business. Let's dive in. Darren, thank you so much for joining me on The Bottom Line.
Thank you for having me, Savan.
We've known each other for a little while now. You helped us out with updating our unit holders agreement, and it was a fun process, I have to say. Well, maybe not so much fun for me. We're thinking about all that stuff. But for those that don't know you, jump into sort of how you got into legal, your journey into Adventum Legal, and so on.
So I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. I actually studied computer science and law. I was one of the first law students at Monash, if not the first, to do an honours degree in computer science and law. I then did a separate master's of computer science, and you're probably wondering why I'm not a techie. It's because I did try that, but I actually loved being a lawyer. And my passion is generally most of my clients are tech companies. So we act for startups, we act for investors in startups, we act for scale-ups, we act for larger tech companies, and we act for venture capital funds. But what I've also seen over the years is because tech is part of every business, we now act for a lot more businesses that aren't traditional tech, but they use a lot of tech. So, for example, we act for energy retailers, we act for engineering companies. So it's quite a wide, diverse client base. The firm is now 6 years old. I was a partner in two previous firms, and I thought to myself at the age of 45 that it was time to have my own adventure. And when I was looking about, well, how do I name this firm, I decided to call it Adventum Legal, which Adventum means adventure in Latin. And I thought it mirrors what my clients go through, which is they all have their own adventure. And for me, it was time for my adventure.
I love that, Adventum. It's funny when I help clients with setting up businesses and strategy, business plans, some of them will come with no strategy, bit of a business idea, but they know the name or they're so fixated by the name. But I love that name. That's so cool. Take us through your journey, sort of just as a business owner. What made you get out of a partnership? I knew it's obviously an adventure, but what was the sticking points for you that wanted it to be just yourself, your little thing? What was that?
I think it was because I wanted to be the master of my own destiny. And you're part of a partnership, and a lot of people are in partnership structures. And I was in two partnership structures. And I have to say, I really enjoyed my time in those structures. And I've still got lots of friends who I worked with. But I woke up one day and I thought, look, I want to give it a go myself. I want to actually set my own destiny. I work with entrepreneurs every day, and they all did the same thing. They've all brushed off on me. And every time I meet someone really amazing and impressive, I think, wow, why aren't I doing that? And I just frankly didn't want to die wondering. And so I just literally thought, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start a law firm.
And 6 years on, any regrets?
None. Every day is a new day. Look, law is interesting. I've been at it for, close to 30 years, but you still see new problems all the time. And Experience is great. Almost 30 years experience means I've pretty much always got a solution to those problems, but I'm always seeing a different problem. Rarely do you see something twice that is identical in law. And that is what I love about the profession.
And it's funny you said that. Never really thought of law in this manner. You get the phone call when there's generally 90% of the time a problem, unless you're doing a few little commercial legal stuff, but generally you're problem solving for clients.
Yeah, so we are like firefighters. We really are. And, we put fires out, but often we like to take steps with clients to ensure that there'll never be a fire. So, as you were saying earlier, there is work that we do that is more on the commercial side. And I should say our firm is not a litigation firm. We don't go to court. We don't like dispute work. We are purely corporate and commercial. And so what that means is, yes, we put out fires and we solve problems, but we do a lot of strategic planning with clients to try and minimize the chance that there ever will be a problem.
Obviously, your background in computer science has led you to this niche of tech. And the reason we get along really well, I've got a lot of tech clients, some mutual clients, but a lot of tech companies don't have massive amounts of capital. And today's topic, you've become a bit of an expert and you do a lot of employee share schemes, employee share option plans, and so popular in the tech world. What does this world mean? What does employee share schemes mean? What does it mean bringing an employee to ownership? Is it different to partnership? Take us through high level this world.
So most tech companies are expected to offer some form of equity to employees. And by that, I mean the incoming employees expect it, the owners expect it, it's going to be expected of them, right? And the investors often expect it. So it's very much part and parcel of being a tech business. It is very rare to find a tech business nowadays that either doesn't have an employee share scheme already in effect or already planned. And what is an employee share scheme? Well, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's giving employees effectively a share of your business. And that is done through generally either giving them what we call options, which is a right to shares, or giving them shares, or some of your listeners may have heard the term a phantom share scheme, which is not necessarily ownership, but a share of the profits through what is really just a bonus scheme.
And let's take us through. So employee share scheme, so that's direct equity. Just take us through an example of how that might play out for a business.
So there's different types of scenarios, and it starts with who's going to participate and why. So some businesses will limit the grant of equity to, say, just senior management. Some will limit it to just one or two senior managers. So sometimes I see the owners come to me and say, look, we want to have our CFO buy in. We really like them. Or we want the CIO or CTO. And often they want someone to come on board, and that's almost like a partnership. Then there's others which are more broad-based, where a lot of employees are invited to participate. And so what often happens is you start with the why and you start with the who. And that then dictates the implementation and what people receive. And it is very important to understand there is a difference between options and shares. Most employee share schemes are either options or shares. Some are a little bit more exotic. They'll have things like performance rights, either other terms people might have heard, restricted stock units, and so on. But most are options and shares. The difference is an option is a right to a share at some point in the future, and a share is an actual share of your company. And deciding which one you want to grant then has a large range of flow-on effects.
So take us through the why. When customers and clients come to you and say, Darren, I've got these 3 guys, I want to give them shares. Why do you think owners should incentivize their staff? Who are the right people in your mind? If you were in their shoes, what are the thinkings that you would do before you go and choose those people? What are the key criteria to think through?
So if we're thinking about sharing with a small group, say your key leadership team, which is often how these things start, the why can be started from 2 approaches. One is the owner wants to get the next generation into the business. And this is more a transfer of ownership, dressed up as an employee share plan. The other is I don't want to lose these people. I can't afford to pay them more. So I want to give them a share of the business and say to them, eventually, if and when we sell, you will get a share of that. So that's the why. That then leads into the what, the how you then implement it.
I've had examples of clients that we've talked about bringing in employees as owners. When you bring employees and they know it's an employee share scheme, are they genuinely business partners? How do their operations work? So if you're CFO, CTO, does their role change? Do they get more access to numbers? What do you advise your clients to do in terms of reporting? What does that look like? Or is it just business as usual and they've employees that have got some shares? How does that work?
Okay, so it is very much dependent on what you want for your company. What you've just described is the menu. And the menu is you can choose to make your employees your partners, meaning that they're owners, they sit in high level ownership meetings with you, they're meeting with you and the accountant regularly to discuss numbers. When there's finance required for the business, they might even have to give a guarantee just like you. That's the high level. And the reason you will do that is because you're looking ideally to transition ownership to them over time, or ideally what I call to transition headaches, meaning that you are, as the business owner, just desperate to share the mental load with someone who is committed as you are. Then there's another side of the spectrum, which is I don't want my employees thinking I now work for them. So I've given them equity. I don't expect them to walk into my office and demand I work harder to make them richer, right? And you'd be amazed some employees have that attitude. There are a whole range of approaches. Probably the least touch approach is I'm giving you this equity so you can participate in the sale. So I'm going to give it to you today, and then I'll check in with you at some point in the future, give you updates as and when I decide. But effectively, you don't have a say in the business over and above your employment role. You don't necessarily have a share of dividends, but you will participate in the sale. And I'll give you the information I think is appropriate.
Okay, so in that scenario, the why would be this particular group are motivated by value increasing, participating and being part of that journey if there's an exit at one point. But along the journey, they don't really get detailed on how the profit and loss is going in a detailed manner. They probably may not even have oversight on who's getting paid what. It might have some strategic overview on the areas that they're responsible for, but overall, it's business as usual, knowing that if there's an exit situation, that they will participate. Is that sort of a good summation of that style of approach?
It is, except one thing I'd add is you control the information flows and use it as a motivational tool. So you would, for example, think about sharing good news with employees. So you might decide to share numbers. You might have presentations for what you might call the ownership group where you talk about revenue numbers and how things are tracking. You may not do it by exposing a profit and loss. You might just draw a graph and show a line on the graph. You may share recent valuation information, such as we've just raised capital from an investor and this was the valuation, and employees may get very excited, being those people who got their options or shares at a much lower price. So you're showing them value. You're showing them that, hey, it's worth sticking around because you stand to make a lot of money. Now, the flip side of that is when values fall, which is what we've seen with a lot of tech companies over the last couple of years, where employees have options that are what we call underwater, meaning that the exercise price or the price you must pay to convert your option to a share is more than the value of the share itself. And that can be highly demotivating for an employee. It might mean the employee thinks, well, I'm not going to stick around. My options are underwater. I thought I had all this value. I don't have value anymore. So hence, you need to choose carefully what information you share.
With employee share schemes, let's say you've picked your 4 or 5 senior leadership group. They have the shares. Do they pay for it? How does that happen? You can't just give it to them. There's be some tax issues around that. Tuck us through the mechanics on, let's say I've got 3 people. I want to give them 1% each or give them rights, pay for it. How does that remuneration money work? And what are the options there?
So the first step is, yes, look, they do have to pay for it. They do, because as you've highlighted, if they're issued shares at a discount, there is an income tax problem. So the first step for lawyers and accountants that we deal with is how do we get people into this business in a tax effective way? And generally with shares, and there are different approaches with shares and options, but with shares, we do make employees, or we often recommend that they do pay for it, and they pay market value or various tax planning reasons, potentially just under market value. Now, the next question is, well, where do they get the money from? Because obviously, if your business is worth a lot, employees who have mortgages don't just have a lot of money sitting around to buy in. So quite often the business lends to the employee, but the money goes round in a circle. So the business will lend the issue price of the shares to the employee, and the employee will pay it straight back to the business. And that's what we call a loan funded plan. Now, what that means though, is that that debt still sits there. So for example, if you issued me $1 million worth of shares, I would have to borrow, say, $1 million from you to give you $1 million. I still owe you $1 million. What that means is if the business sells in the future and say my shares are worth $3 million at the time, I would only keep the difference, which is the $2 million profit, because I'd still have to give you $1 million.
And what about a company? Like, a lot of the time, we're not just in the business of trying to create value and sell it. Some of these tech businesses, generally what they tend to do. But if you've got an ordinary business, like an accounting firm or a printing business, what are the scenarios? Because those businesses generally can make really good cash flows, and it's about retaining staff where they want to get a return on investment. They want to see that dividend grow. But the directors, let's use a printing business as an example, over the last 10 years, it's very capital intensive. The business owners have reinvested a lot of the money, and historically there hasn't been dividends paid. But this scenario is a bit of cash flow to pay off that loan, but also a value. Talk us through the conversations you would have with an employee where you have to be open and honest around dividends. And then at that point, when it is a cash flow business, how much do you really share? Because like, oh, we're not issuing a dividend. And then they were like, hold on, we've just tripled our revenue. Why was there no dividends? I feel like there's this risk that can happen in terms of bringing in employees that aren't normally entrepreneurial or business owners at that point. So what are your thoughts on that, and what are your advice do you have?
So you always start with what is the value of the business. And for most business owners, it's worth a lot less than what you think, right? And that can be really good for an employee share scheme, because you have a value in your mind of what you would sell for. But a valuer can look at your business and look at the numbers at a point in time and look at the market multiples, for example, and say, look, this right now, today, isn't worth very much at all. But you're not selling today, so it doesn't matter for you. But for your employees, it means that you can get them in potentially at a lower price. So then the next question comes down to, well, how do I get them in? And if we go back to that loan-funded share plan I was talking about, which is a common way of getting employees in, it's not the only way, but it's a common way. It means that the loan is a lot less. And then we come back to your dividends, because the employees will say, well, hold on, I need to be able to pay off that loan. I want to have that loan ideally close to zero when the business sells, funded by dividends, so I can maximize my return. So what we tend to do is say, well, okay, if the business pays dividends, we will take those dividends, we'll give some of it to you to pay your tax, we'll give some of it to you to spend, and we'll take the rest towards the loan, and we'll continue to reduce the loan. Now, employees might say, well, what happens if my shares are underwater?
What does that mean? What is underwater?
Well, let's say, using that example earlier where I talked about an employee being lent $1 million. And let's say in the future, those shares were only worth $800,000. So you would think that if the shares were sold, the employee would still owe you $200,000. Well, what we tend to do in these plans is we make the loan limited recourse. And what that basically means is that the employee, that the remainder of the debt, in other words, the difference between what the shares are worth and what you owe on the loan, if there's still a deficit, effectively it's forgiven, because the company's only recourse is to those shares and to the proceeds of sale of those shares. So you create a risk-free, or almost risk-free, I should say, outcome for the employees.
And when you issue those employee share schemes, in a corporate register, you have generally when you set up a company, there's ordinary shares, which has all the rights under the constitution of the company, voting and all the rest. Are these tagged separately so that they're identifiable as employee shares, or are they ordinary?
Well, different schemes can have different classes of shares. Most schemes have ordinary shares or options which convert to ordinary shares. And there's a range of detailed reasons for that. And I will say mainly tax in some ways, because there are various things in the Tax Act that talk about ordinary shares. There's also corporate, I wouldn't quite say legal reasons, but more commercial reasons, in the sense that you say to your employees, well, you've got the same rights that I have. You're on the same level as me. But there are other schemes where you might have non-voting shares. You might say to the employees, look, I'm giving you these shares to participate in dividends and to be able to sell them to make lots of money, hopefully when we sell the business. But I don't want you coming to shareholder meetings. I'm the only one who's going to vote. It's still my business effectively at the end of the day. This is a profit-making tool for you. So if I need to get something done, I don't want to have to ask my lawyer to prepare notices of meetings and wait 21 days, and comply with all this formality. I just want to be able to get the corporate stuff done just like I was doing before, but ensure that you are also rewarded.
So does that mean that that document around those decision making and is that in their employee share scheme arrangement that's all stipulated, and therefore you don't need a shareholders agreement?
It depends again on how the plan is structured. So when you put in place an employee share plan, there's different ways it's documented. One is you'll have what we call plan rules. You'll have potentially an offer letter. You might have a loan agreement. And then you might have a shareholders agreement. If they're going to have particular rights attached to their shares, you would generally make them a party to your shareholders agreement and put one in place. Or you can capture some of the more relevant rights in the plan documents. There is no one size fits all solution for every business. It always starts with the why. Why are you doing this? And then we talk about the how, and there's nuances between every implementation.
It also sounds like you can actually, ignoring the tax laws for the moment, it sounds like you pretty much have a blank piece of paper and a pen and really nearly have the ability to create your own rules, your own version of how the business is going to operate, what rights and responsibilities you have. Is that a fair comment, or you got some boundaries you have to work within for it to make sense?
Well, normally what you would do is effectively pick from a menu of solutions. You don't want to create something too out there and start with a blank piece of paper, because then what you're doing is going into uncharted territory. So what we like to do is ensure that we look at the menu and we pick something that works for you. Then you go from there. And that solution can be implemented in a whole range of different ways.
How do businesses usually decide how much equity to allocate to employees? Is it 1%, 0.5%, 10%? What is your experience, the rule of thumb? Like, how much do you allocate?
It really depends on you. And by that, I mean how big your business is. So, for example, if you've got a business that's worth $100 million, it's going to be very hard to give a senior person 2%, because that's $2 million. And then you've got to look at how is that funded. And we did talk about the loan funded plans, but there are some other complications. When you've got a startup, you often see that startups, for example, allocate 20% of their equity to what they call their option pool. And they then issue those options as new people come on board. But one of the problems is you exhaust the option pool very quickly. You make some big hires, you make some big promises. And then you're often going back to your shareholder group and saying, hey, can we please have more options that we can give away?
And what that does in essence is dilute the ordinary shareholder. Is that correct? You might allocate 20%. You start with 100% ordinary. And as you make hires, the more of the 20% that gets used up, there's a dilution. That's cool. Now let's talk about option plans. It's slightly different. So that isn't actually equity right now. To define it, is it you have the right to buy in the future at a price we set today. So let's say the business is worth 100 million. Let's use share price. Let's say the share price is $1,000. You have the right to buy in the future at the $1,000 price. Take us through what that looks like. Can you set it every year? Is it 5 years? Is it open-ended? And why would you do option plans like that? Because that doesn't have loans, doesn't have dividends. They actually don't have equity at that point. You're creating this thing for the future. How does that work, and why do you need where the option plan is the right thing there?
So one of the reasons we use option plans more often than issuing straight shares is because, and I'll say this bluntly, options are easier to take away. So one of the things you need to think about is what happens when my employee leaves and I want to take away their options and give them to their replacement hire. So that's one of the reasons for option plans. The other reason is that you can still get the same outcome, which is the ability to participate in the sale of the business as you can with shares. So using your example, if I'm issued one option today that allows me to convert that option or exercise it to be issued one share and the exercise price is $1,000 because that share is worth $1,000. If in the future someone comes along to buy the business and they're willing to pay $10,000 per share, I would either exercise, meaning I'd pay my $1,000 to get $10,000, but more likely what happens in most exit events is that I never exercise. My option is just bought by the purchaser or cancelled by the company, one or the other, and I just get paid the net amount, the difference being the $9,000. And that's why we tend to favour option plans, because they are a lot simpler to operate. They're easier to deal with when people come and go, and they're very easy to deal with in an exit. They don't give a participant shareholder rights. And from a legal perspective, that's important because you're not facing a potential shareholder dispute. So if you've got a troublesome employee and you want to fire them, what you don't want is to be not just before the Fair Work Commission or in federal court, but you don't also want to have to deal with a minority shareholder oppression claim. And that's one of the reasons we use option plans. It just makes it simpler, but can achieve the same economic outcome as owning shares. With one rider, you don't get dividends as an option holder. So if you have a business that is profitable and pays a lot of dividends, option holders won't participate. But there are ways to allow them to participate.
Talk us through exiting. We discussed this exiting employee a little bit. Employee not performing, there's no performance rights in their agreement. They're now shareholders. They have shares and you're like, oh no, this guy's not doing well. I've got to move him on. How does that work? Can we put in mechanisms where you pay them less at exit? Take us through some of the things you go through with your clients, how you explain what exit might look like if there is a situation that arises that way.
So this always becomes a lengthy discussion. What happens when the employee leaves? And they either leave because they chose to leave, they resigned. They leave sometimes because something sad happened, like there was a health event, they got sick, they can't work anymore. They leave because you made them redundant, or they leave because you fired them. And often in your option plans, you will deal with those situations differently. And one of the ways you deal with them is through a mechanism, what we call vesting, which is vesting is another way of just calling an option or a share as earned. You earned it, you did your time. So, for example, you see many option plans that say, well, if you leave after a certain period of time and you're a good leaver, so you'll designate between what we call good and bad leavers. So a good leaver might be someone who was made redundant. It wasn't their fault. Someone who got sick and they had to leave. It's not their fault, so we call them a good leaver. But you might call a bad leaver someone who you fired. And also, I often find with clients, they sit in two camps about someone who resigned. Some clients will say, look, if you resigned, you did your time, you earned your shares, we'll call you, or you earned your options, we'll call you a good leaver. Others are like, you resigned, you left the team, you're a bad leaver. Now, once the person is a good or a bad leaver, then the question comes down to what do they keep? Often in plans, you'll see they keep, if they're a good leaver, they will keep what we call the vested options or the vested shares. Vesting is normally by time or it could be by performance. For example, an option might vest, say, for example, if KPIs are hit, or all your options might vest 25% per year over 4 years, which is time-based. If they're a good leaver, you might say, well, look, we'll let you keep your vested options. We'll retain the right to buy them back at market value in the future, but you can keep them. But your unvested ones, your unvested options, well, you'll just lose them, and we don't have to pay you anything. Now, this is where shares and options are different. For options, it's just that easy. For shares, it's not so easy just to take shares away. You then have to go through potentially a process of share buybacks, which are complicated in themselves, triggering transfers. It gets really complicated when you issue shares. And there is no one size fits all solution, but you just have to work through the different solutions in that situation.
In a scenario where you say, okay, it's vested, you're a good leaver, they've got shares worth, let's call it at market value, $500,000. Normally they get paid out and they leave, or do they just become a shareholder and now they're working for someone else? Sounds complicated why you would keep someone and then maybe the business doesn't have the money at that point in time to pay it out. Going into this, I had sort of views on different ones. I'm starting to like the employee share option plans a lot more. I mean, I don't know whether you have a favorite. You're probably going to say, it's full based on what you're looking to do. How does it work in that scenario? Guys left, good lever, $500,000. Can you just say, look, we're not buying it. It's worth good money. Hold on to them.
Yeah, well, you've actually hit on a very good issue, which is when there's a lot of value, firstly, you don't want to create an incentive to leave where the only way to get my money out of the business is if I leave. I've seen that quite a bit where people say, well, look, we aren't planning to sell the business for some time. So you've got a senior person who, say, has borrowed money from the business. They're paying down their loan via dividends, for example. They're looking at their financial situation and they think, gosh, if I leave, I can trigger a buyout. So what you do in your option or share plans is you put all the power in your hands. So as you said earlier, if someone's shares are worth $500,000, you as the business owner decide if and when you buy those shares back. So then you decide. And what it may mean is that you've got someone on your cap table who is unfriendly in the long term. And there are ways in your option plan rules or your share plan rules to deal with that from a valuation perspective. Because again, just because you say it's worth $500,000 doesn't mean it's actually worth $500,000. There are different ways to value a business. Some option plans use independent valuations, some use formulas, some use net asset basis, and so on. There are different ways. And these are the things you need to think through when you're putting one together, which is what happens. The main issue always is what happens when someone leaves.
What are some of the real success stories? So take us through an example or a live scenario that you've been involved in where you saw a tech startup or whoever it was, set it up, and you're like, this just played out exactly the way it should have, and it was super successful and that you're proud of. And I'm sure you got many of those. Can you take us through an example where you were involved?
I've had a number where clients of mine, so I've been, as I said, in the game almost 30 years. In that time, I've seen some clients go from zero to hundreds of millions. I've seen some very big sales. I can't name them, unfortunately, as a lawyer.
That's okay.
That takes the fun away. So in those situations, the employees have done pretty well. Sometimes they've done well, but they're never happy. And I will say this, that is something to be aware of. Often as a business owner, you will form deep long-term friendships with your employees. These people could be working with you for 5, 10, 15 years, and they become your mates and you're their mate. But at the end of the day, you're still the boss and you're still the owner of the business and they're the employee. I've seen a lot of friendships come undone when at sale time, the option holders, the employees see the boss walk away with a lot of money in the millions and their reward is in the thousands. And I've seen a lot of bitterness over time. So that is something to think about in terms of how you allocate. But there are many success stories. I mean, there's many public success stories. Just look at the employees of Canva. I'm sure they're very, very happy at the moment. You pick any big listed tech company and there were employees who were there from the very first day. And those employees were probably looked after with a close to $0 strike price or exercise price, as in other words call that. And they're sitting on many, many millions. But at a private company level, there are many sales that go on and employees can do very, very well. But it's about sometimes getting that right balance. As a business owner, in your own mind, you've got to think about, well, how much do I want to reward these people in a sale? Now, I should say I've seen also many examples where the business owner tops up. They actually take less out of the sale. They say, you know what? The employees aren't going to get enough. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. I don't need $100 million. I'm happy to take 90 million or 95 million. It's not going to make a difference to my life at my age now, whether I've got 90 or 100, or I can take the 90 and invest it to make 100 by next year. But that extra 10 million will change lives.
Have you seen that happen?
I've seen top-ups. I've seen in M&A deals that an allocation for an employee bonus on top of the options is made. It gets complicated because it can, so in a mergers and acquisition, often it's the company paying out the bonus and that tips into working capital. And when your working capital is below what the buyer expected, that means a slightly lower price. So at the end of the day, the owner always pays, but I have seen it.
And what about in reverse? Surely there's some horror stories. Can you take us through an example where you're like, set it all up, all the legals offshore at Adventum Legal would have been awesomely prepared, but it just didn't work. What can we learn from that?
I suppose, look, the sad stories are those where employees gave years and years of service and the business went broke. And I've seen a few of those over the last couple of years. The horror stories, as I call them, are, if I think about the things that go wrong in option plans, tax is a big one. That's a massive one. People, I'll call it, did it on the cheap, didn't get the advice the first time round, and either they or the employees are hit with an enormous tax bill. The other, I'll call it, if we want to talk horror stories, is, and the massive complexity is when you have employees overseas. Massive, massive complexity. So I've got a lot of clients, they're tech businesses, they have offices in America, they have offices in Europe, have offices in Asia, and they say to me, I want to reward my employees in those countries. And what I have to explain to them is every country has different laws, different tax rules, different corporate law rules. The US is a great example. I've had clients who didn't get it done properly in the US and created a potential tax nightmare for themselves and a tax nightmare for the employee participants. Now, if you do that, and I'll use that as an example with the US, Donald Trump's not necessarily going to know you exist because you're an Australian company. The IRS isn't going to come after you. But when you sell your business and there's due diligence, this will come out and there will be a potential reduction in price, a potential warranty or indemnity holdback, and you will pay in some way. Even if you're not paying the IRS, you will pay when you sell your business because it will be a major risk factor for the buyer.
And let's talk about tax without getting too technical and putting our listeners to sleep. Talk us through some of the tax high-level considerations that we need to make in this space.
Yeah, so this is one of the areas that seems to touch almost every single tax we can think of that we have to pay, bar GST. So, for example, if you issue options or shares at a discount to market value, then straight away there's a potential income tax problem for the employee where they have to pay it immediately, being the difference between the market value and what they actually pay for the option or the share, right? That's the first issue. They might have to pay it in that current tax year, or they might have to pay on what we call a deferred basis. There's potential for salary sacrifice schemes. Then on top of that, for you as or I should say for the employee, they will potentially have to pay capital gains tax when they sell the option or the share. For you as the employer, you have to think about things like fringe benefits tax, payroll tax, Division 7A, if they're an existing shareholder and you want to lend them money to come on board. I think I've run out of all the taxes.
That's pretty full on. And in terms of phantom shares, we touched on that. I don't want to leave the interview with you without touching on the phantom shares. So you said it's a pseudo bonus scheme. How can you package that up where maybe we're not going into the complexities of employee share schemes or ESOP? What's phantom shares in essence and what does it look like?
So they're very popular overseas and effectively it's a fancy way of saying, look, I'm not giving you shares, but I'm going to give you the economic benefit as if you held shares. So what does that mean? I'll put in place a scheme that if I sell the business, you will get a percentage of that sale as if you held a certain number of shares. If I pay a dividend, I might pay you an employment bonus equivalent to you holding a certain number of shares. It's a fancy phrase for what effectively is a bonus scheme. They're not as popular here in Australia. And the reason they're not as popular is because generally we can, I'll call it not fix the tax problems, but create an employee share plan that operates in a tax effective manner, meaning that you don't really need to go down the phantom share route. Because if you go down the phantom share route, there's no real tax benefit to the employee. It's just income. There's no capital gains tax 50% discount, for example. You just get taxed when you receive the money.
At the full amount because you haven't
That's it.
held the shares. Okay. Darren, obviously business owners listening to this might be interested. How do you engage with your clients if they were to ring you and say, Darren, we're interested, we've got 2 or 3 staff, we know the why, or we want to talk through about the why and consider our options. How do you engage with clients and what journey do you take them through to give them this advice?
We always start with the why. And the why can often change when we dig a little bit deeper. So sometimes it's, I really just want to keep these people, I need to give some equity. Then we dig deeper and it's, I actually am sick of not sleeping at night and I need someone to share the mental load. Sometimes it's the other way around. I want someone to share the mental load, but actually, no, that's not really it. I just don't want these people to leave. So we start with that. Then we start with well, how many people? Is it 3? Is it 30? And then what we do is we then start exploring the different potential solutions, options versus shares. And I'll throw some fancy terms out here: loan funded plans, premium priced options. Do we have an employee share trust? And then we have to look at your structure. Are you a unit trust? Are you a company? Are you a partnership, which is only really more common with professional services firms? And it's a process of exploration. Well, the cost is relatively small if you're, say, a smaller business and you just want a option plan, for example, that can take advantage of a tax concession called the startup tax concession. That's actually relatively affordable. We've had much bigger businesses, though, businesses with hundreds of employees, say, look, we want a plan that we can roll out to 100 or 200 employees over time. Maybe there's a separate plan for the core management team, or it's the same plan, but they've got separate metrics. And, we want to have potentially an employee share trust. We've got private equity in our business. We need to think of them. We're looking at a listing down the track. And those plans I could spend a year on sometimes.
Wow.
Yeah, in multiple meetings with the clients, going through the machinations, preparing documents, road testing them with staff, and talking to the advisors. You've also got to think about rolling it into your longer term plans. Like, when are you selling? Are you selling, or are you looking for long-term partners and you're going to pass the business down to your kids? So there's lots of different drivers. So engagement is initially it's a process of exploration, asking questions and then challenging you on why you're doing this. Because quite often as we challenge, the why changes. We get to the real reason. And the reason we do that is because we want to give you something that suits what you genuinely need, not what you're telling us you need or telling yourself you need, but really that's not the real reason.
And for a sort of a standard business, and I don't want to quote you on this, but so you would have an initial conversation. It sounds like that would be quite a detailed consultation, unpacking the why. Do you normally go, okay, come in, we'll sit down I'd be doing this for at least 2 hours, but for an hour or two, bit of like a workshop, you pay X dollars. If you're still keen and you want to participate, we then put together a strategic plan, maybe different options. You pay for that. And then if you proceed to contract, sort of like a phased process. Is that sort of how it works?
Yeah, look, it is.
And the costings around that, sort of a basic, just to give the audience a bit of an idea of sort of.
Yeah, I understand. Look, it always starts with a, say, 1 to 2 hour meeting. Now, I should say quite often it's rarely just employee share plan. So the employee share plan is often on the shopping list. When new clients come in, it's I need a shareholders agreement. I need an employee share plan. I need my terms and conditions done. I'm starting up a new business. We're moving overseas. Can you help us with everything? So the employee share plan often forms part of that, and it falls within all of that. And so you're correct. Look, it is a initial consult. The way we tend to work it, if it is just employee share plan, is we do for, and I'll call it the lower end, the more straightforward plans, we do fixed price offerings, and they range between $5,000 and $7,000 plus GST at the moment. Don't quote me on pricing in 10 years, but at the moment. And that's what we'll charge for what we call a startup style option plan, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. Some of the more complicated share plans can go into the $20,000, $30,000 range. Some can even go to $100,000. And that's for the very big businesses where there's lots of consultation and lots of exploration. and lots of documents and major tax issues. So they can vary, but they don't need to be overly expensive initially. But as I said earlier, I do find it's wrapped up. It's never seen in isolation. It's wrapped up as part of a broader picture. And if it's not, if someone just comes to me for an employee option plan and that's all they want, then my first question is going to be, well, let's talk about everything else first, because I can't just solve this problem for you in isolation. I need to understand everything about you and your business to see, is this even right for you? Because often people come in thinking this is the solution to a particular problem, and it's not.
Darren, we could probably talk for hours, dive even deeper into this topic. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been amazing for the firm in terms of helping us out and taking your time to come out today. I know that it's been an intriguing episode for me. I've learned so much on it. I hope our listeners have too. And I want to thank you for, looking after our clients and us over the journey.
Mate, thank you for having me. It's been a great chat.
This is The Bottom Line, a show designed to help Australian businesses succeed. This podcast was produced by accountancy firm Alexander Spencer. At Alexander Spencer, we've been helping business owners realise their goals since 1952, and we play a pivotal role in developing, implementing, and supervising the business goals and strategies of our clients. To find out how we can help your business succeed, head to our website, alexanderspencer.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of The Bottom Line, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Savan Tuna, and we'll be back next episode with more tips to help you transform your business. And that's The Bottom Line.